All right, and welcome back. So this is the last lecture for this course, and it's just gonna be a speed run. I teach a whole course on contemporary art that concentrates on what's going on in the last 50, 60 years. So if you want a more in-depth treatment of these topics, then be sure to check that out. That should be coming next semester. I'll be churning out those lectures next semester, and they'll be on YouTube if you want to listen to them. But I did feel like I wanted to give people a sense of where we've gone in the last 50, 60 years and how we've managed this transition into what we call contemporary art. One of the big themes that comes up is that everything old is new again. There's going to be a lot of revivals, a lot of reinterpretations, and going back to the past. By the time we reached the end of the 60s, we had pretty much exhausted every avenue imaginable. If you think about it, abstraction had been completely explored. There was nowhere left to go with that. Abstraction moved into sculpture and light art and land art. So all of the tenets of high modernism, all of those had been really thoroughly explored. And then we went the other direction. We were exploring identity art with things like feminism. And then also with activism, we were also experimenting in performance art, destroying the boundaries between performer and the artwork and even the audience. So we really had gotten very radical. So it makes sense that after all of this radicalism, there would kind of be a return to form. There would be a return to figuration and actual representation. And one of the first to come out was photorealism. So we have a return to representation, a return to actual recognizable things. But as you can guess, it's not going to be like it was before. It's an incredibly accurate style of painting. That's why we call it photorealism, because it was meant to mimic the quality of a photograph. It is mimicking the aesthetics of a photograph, which can capture every detail in perfect lucidity. So, how is it different? Well, for one, it's not going to be focused on great historical narratives. It's not going to be like the academic art of the past. They're not going to go back and rediscover classicism. Instead, they're going to be doing a lot of mundane stuff. They tend to like shiny, new, reflective surfaces. In a weird kind of way, photorealism is a response to both abstract expressionism and pop art. Pop art was all about mass media, mass-produced objects. And so when you look at this phone booth by Richard Estes, you can see this is a mass-produced object. But at the same time, it's this shiny reflective surface, so it gives a random quality. That's a little bit like abstract expressionism. So these photorealistic paintings are monumental, like the abstract expressionist paintings, but the subject matters are going to be mundane and trivial. It's more about the quality that these mundane, everyday objects produce. So this is realism, but is interpreted through the lens of pop art and abstract expressionism. One thing that you'll notice about all of these is they're rather dehumanizing. When you look at the works of Richard Estes or Ralph Goings, you never see the faces of people. They're about the objects. The people are looking away from you. They tend to love things like automobiles and reflective surfaces, shiny chrome, like this beautiful diner. Audrey Flack, who's getting a wonderful retrospective today, who's finally getting some recognition. She had some recognition then, but I mean, she was recognized at the time. But she's got a massive new retrospective going on. Beautiful stuff. But she would do these kind of compositions that, again, were made entirely of objects. So in a way, the objects kind of become symbols again. This one's called Queen, and we have both the Queen from a chess set and the Queen of Hearts from a deck of cards, plus things like makeup and other things that are put together to make a kind of emblem or symbolism. All of these things are really lusciously beautiful and painstakingly done. The most famous of all the photorealists has to be Chuck Close. Chuck Close developed a method where he would grid out a photo and then he would paint it in monumental scale. I love these pictures because they give you a sense of how big they are. He would take these photos of his friends and associates and blow them up to the size of Easter Island heads. And like Easter Island heads, they have that kind of monumentality, but they're also kind of dehumanizing. He didn't paint celebrities. He's only recently begun to paint celebrities, but at the time he refused to paint celebrities or people of note. The portrait didn't matter. The identity of the person in the portrait was always the important thing, but in this case, it's not the identity of the person. He was looking at them as objects, as subjects to paint. Here's a photo of himself that he broke down into a grid and then blew out into a monumental painting. So in a way, the technique, the meticulous technique of gridding this out is very similar to what an abstract expressionist might do. It's process-related art, and so therefore it takes the human function out of it. People are always impressed by the technical skill of photorealism, but it's really not all that hard. You take your time, you grid things out, you can really do it. I mean, go look on YouTube. There's literally thousands of people doing photorealistic stuff. But the thing about photorealism is that it's technical, and it impresses you with the technical quality of it, but it's so technical and precise that it limits the artist's expression. Remember how we talked about the painter's mark? That the modernists wanted the brushworks to be seen because that was another level of expression. And this is about removing that level of expression, removing the artist in some way. Chuck Close was aware of that, so he began experimenting with other ways of putting the paint down, but still keeping this kind of photorealistic style. Remember, he's painting these on a colossal scale, and so what he did is he started working on portraits in fingerprints, using multiple, like fingerprint layers to create the lights and the darks. Eventually, he started gridding out his paintings. This painting that you see over here on the left is actually made up of a series of little grids of mixed colors. So it has almost like this pixelated quality. It's almost the quality of what you see in a print. If you know print media, print is just made up of little dots. Go get a magnifying glass and look at something in a printed book. It's just thousands of little dots of cyan, magenta, yellow, and black all mixed together. Because of this, people often assume that he was influenced by computers. He denied this. He said, no, it was more about the process of it. He himself suffered a debilitating accident, a kind of medical condition that left him virtually paralyzed. He called it the event. It was a spinal artery collapse, and he's been confined to a wheelchair ever since with minimal use of his hands. But because of the technique, where he can make these little kind of boxes, he actually was able to continue creating. So the technique and the scale of it makes it possible for him to continue. Here you can see him gridding out one of his own faces and doing it in this kind of pixelated technique, which, as you look at each one little individual piece, feels very abstract. As you look at each one of these little circles, it looks like an abstraction, but you pull it all back together, it becomes this very shiny, glossy, almost photographic kind of quality image. So again, dealing with the ideas of mass production, but also dealing with the issues of abstract expressionism. So there is a revival of naturalism and figurative art in the 1960s and 70s, but the one thing that we can say about it is that it is as emotional detachment. That is, whereas the human figure was almost always kind of this high point of art and the hierarchy of painting before, now you're going to see art that removes the kind of importance of the figure. The figures just get treated like objects. Pearlstein is perhaps the most famous for this. People said that when he painted his paintings, he was more interested in the objects in the background than he was in his sitters. That he treated them as if they were still life. I wonder, everybody in the world has speculated on why this happens. I think that after modernism, you simply couldn't return to pure naturalism. It was seen as kind of too passé. It was seen as done. So you had to give it a new spin. And if it's one thing that Marx had absolutely right about modern life, is that people in the modern world have a great deal of alienation. We have all this wealth and comfort and security, but we are alienated from the world around us, we're alienated from each other, and you can see that detachment and alienation pop up in the art all the time. I mean, these people look positively bored. Not just bored, but almost unpersoned in a way. David Hockney would do the same kind of thing. David Hockney, who's very famous now for the Hockney-Falco hypothesis, where he suggested that all of these 15th, 16th, 17th century painters were essentially using camera lucidas or camera obscuras or optical devices to trace things instead of to paint them. But before that, he was an artist, and he was a British artist, but active predominantly in LA. And so we're seeing a shift happen geographically. More and more things are happening in LA and outside of New York, in the United States, in the art scene. But he was, you know, really kind of precursor to this kind of sense of pastel color or surface that existed in the 80s, this kind of artificiality. And when you look at his paintings, they have this kind of artificiality. They return to figuration. They return to figuration, but the figures are almost irrelevant. One of my favorite examples of that is Lucian Freud. Lucian Freud is the grandson of Sigmund Freud, a British artist who became probably the most famous naturalist painter of the 1980s and 1990s. But in his own writings, he would talk about how the identity of the subject was really irrelevant to him. He didn't care. He was more interested in the texture that he could produce. He's famous for these heavy impasto textures where you can see the little knobbles on the paint. You can see, you know, I can just point them out here. You can see the texture and the paint here. He loved to paint figures that had a certain texture. He's famous for, once upon a time, having the most expensive painting ever sold by a living artist. This one is called Benefit Supervisor Sleeping. It was painted in 1995. And it's actually a portrait of a woman who was a social worker at a job center. And he painted this. It's actually got bought for $33 million at an auction at Christie's, which was at the time the largest sum. It's since been blown out of the water. The records get broken every year. But at the time, it was the largest sum ever for a living artist. And I think it was bought by some Russian oil oligarch. But at any rate, it's not exactly what you would think of in terms of the classical nude. You have a woman that is clearly obese and has this kind of quality to the flesh. When he was asked about this, he said himself that it's flesh without muscle and has developed a different kind of texture through bearing such a weight-bearing thing. This is a human being he's talking about here. He found this person to be his model, and what he wanted is that she was so fat that her flesh had a different texture, and this gave him a way of exploring as an artist. So this isn't about representing her as a person, it's about representing textures, and that's a really interesting thing, that we've returned to naturalism, but naturalism has become all about painting. It's all about, the textures on the surface. The subject is kind of irrelevant. And you look at Chuck Close's portraits, they kind of dehumanize these portraits. Pearlstein's portraits as well, that they become explorations for the artist. What a kind of interesting reversal. I am glad to say that naturalism has come back. When I was an art student years and years ago, I had a collection there were a few artists that could teach you naturalism, but the vast majority just didn't even know how. Nobody was teaching it anymore. It was considered passé. But now you go everywhere and everybody has kind of explored these old academic techniques. Go on YouTube, you can find videos on how to paint like an old world master. They're all over the place. So there has been a revival in naturalism, but it doesn't seem like we'll ever go back to the kind of naturalism that existed before. It's always going to be something else. It's always going to be given a different spin, a different angle. The direction this goes elsewhere is, logical, is that if you've explored naturalism and you've explored abstraction, the next thing to go is to go back to early modernism. So everything old is new again. And so we have a revival of expressionism, the kind of expressionism that began at the beginning of the 20th century. And this happens everywhere. where you could see it in England and America, but perhaps the place that's most known for being happened is in Germany. So Germany in the 20th century is a complicated place. Can we just say that? Germany went from being the source of World War I and World War II and an enormous amount of death and human atrocity, but then it was conquered. It itself was split in two in the aftermath of World War II. Half of it became East Germany, which fell into the Soviet bloc, and then the other half was, controlled by the West or dominated by the West. And so Germany was right at the heart of the Cold War. And it hasn't been all that long ago, actually, November 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell down. I remember when that happened. I was a young kid when that happened. Well, not a young kid, I was 18, but a lot younger than 50, let me tell you. And so Germany was a very turbulent place. It was right at the crossroads, the nexus of all of this Cold War anxiety that existed in America and around the world for, more than 50 years. And so it makes sense that Germany would have a very complicated relationship with its history. And so Germans return to the kind of expressionism that was being created by people like Kandinsky and Max Beckmann and Kokoschka and Kleins and many of the others that were painting at that time. So, and Otto Dix and the New Objectivists, etc. And those paintings, if you remember, were kind of just interested in the anxiety of the age. They were coming out of World War I. What do we do? How do we explain with it? And of course, for much of the 1970s and 80s, Germany was in the same place. And so here you have Immendorf, which is this kind of painting of Café Deutschland. And you can see all of the references to the Berlin Wall, the barbed wire fences, the tanks, the guards watching people. It is a cafe, but it feels threatening and menacing. George Baselitz would paint pictures, and no, I didn't put this in upside down. This is the way he painted his paintings. You can't get any more anxiety producing than to flip your painting upside down and force these poor, gallery owners to, tilt their heads, their necks sideways, get a crink in their neck, just to figure out what it is you're trying to construct. So the paintings are very expressive and are meant to give people a sense of the anxiety that the age produced. Perhaps the most famous of these is going to be Anselm Kiefer. Anselm Kiefer, even in the 1960s, was doing a series of photographs that he called the occupations. What he did is he went around to all the places that Germany had conquered during World War II, and he gave the Hitlerian salute, which was banned in Germany at the time in the wake of World War II. So it was a very controversial thing to do. But it was a way of him dealing with his German identity. Germans gave us an enormous amount of culture in society. Good heavens, the German domination of music, Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, etc., is really incredible. Plus all the contributions they made to modern art. And all of that was kind of reversed by World War II. So Germans have a very complex, sense of their own history. In many ways, the philosophers, German philosophers like Marx, and German philosophers like Nietzsche and Freud, who was Austrian, but, still part of the German, kind of worldview, still, made up the modern world. They invented the modern world, but they were also responsible for the Holocaust and World War II. So, there's equal amounts of pride and shame. It's an ambiguous kind of heritage that you pass on. And so a lot of artists were dealing with that. This one I love because this one is a direct quotation of the very famous Wander Above a Sea of Fog by Caspar Friedrich, the very famous romantic painter. So the Germans made all these contributions to romantic and other art, and here he is, Kiefer, kind of making commentary on that somehow everything is tainted. He himself would go on to do paintings, and these paintings, again, reference the very complex history that Germany had. This is interior, or Innenraum, and in the German, And this, in fact, is a representation of the Chancellor Hall. The Chancellor Hall was the hall that Adolf Hitler led from for most of the period of Nazi Germany. It was kind of the room that he led. And so we're seeing this hall in a state of decay after it had been bombed out. Many of his paintings then have this kind of tactile quality. They reference the recent past, and they have titles that are very evocative of this sense of where the West has gone. So while we recover figuration and painting, in the end of the days, it's a very kind of hard-edged, cynical take. Pop art also kind of influences this as well. Sigmar Polk comes along and starts creating these screen-printed scenes of Playboy bunnies, and he introduced a term called capitalist realism. Now, capitalist realism is a play on words. There was this thing called socialist realism. Socialist realism was the official style of art that existed under Stalin, which was this kind of happy, false, saccharine image of what life was like in the Soviet Union, and it always showed the great leader Stalin in glowing terms, and workers and happy peasants on their collective farms. And of course it was all a lie, and it was all, state-mandated propaganda. But what he was suggesting is that in the capitalist world, people are free to make what they want, but in the end of terms, capitalism has this market, and the market is so compelling that it overrides people's sensibilities. That's why he called it capitalist realism. And so that pop art was, kind of a reaction to this, that, you have propaganda on both sides. It's the difference of whether it's being pushed by a state authority like Stalin or whether it's being pushed by the corporations. So he, played with these ideas. And then also we have individuals like Gerhard Richter who would make pictures like this. Now, this is a painting. It looks like a blurry photograph, but it's in fact an actual painting. And what he would do is he would take an old photograph and he would paint it out, but then he would pull a squeegee over the top of the surface to blur it, to kind of give a sense of what it was really originally, like in the sense of your memory. That is, we think of photographs as memories, but by deconstructing them in this way, we show how they're really kind of fleeting and passing, playing on ideas of memory and record. Very kind of somber stuff. A lot of the stuff is very, kind of down in a way. He himself went on to go do more abstract paintings, doing squeegee paintings where he would pull the paint across the surface with a squeegee. Elsewhere in America and other places, we have similar representations. Eric Fischl would do these kind of dramatic juxtapositions of, kind of ideas and forms. Here we have a visit to, a visit from the island, and in this case we have two very different scenes that kind of break out the differences between class and race. On one side we have rich, white, wealthy tourists enjoying an island retreat, and on the other side we have natives who are, in this case probably Haitians or Jamaicans, experiencing the aftermath of a storm or a hurricane. And so it's interesting how both of these are occurring in the same place, and yet depending on the time of year and the context, we have these sharp breaks in reality. This ultimately, is very closely tied to the concept of deconstruction. And deconstruction is an idea that was introduced to us by the postmodernists. The postmodernists start as a kind of linguistic philosophy, a literary philosophy of French philosophers. Derrida and Foucault were probably some of the biggest players in this. And it could be seen as an extension of critical theory. Critical theory was these philosophers coming out of the Frankfurt School that said, well, you can't always trust the narratives that you're being given, so you need to deconstruct them. You need to pick a side. Postmodernism, in that same way, repudiates the ideas of empiricism or positivism, that you can know something truthfully. So critical theory was like, you can't accept everything that you read. Every book, every article, everything has an agenda, and you have to recognize that it has an agenda, that the person has a worldview. But postmodernism takes it a bit further in arguing that perhaps you cannot get back to an objective truth, that there's no such thing as an objective truth. we have to use language to describe objective truth, and language is inherently subjective. So if you change the language, you change the truth. And so there was an emphasis on this quality of language and perception. And so the only thing that you can do is basically advance one set of language over the other. And what you can do is use that to deconstruct and to see, kind of past it. So postmodernism is even more experimental than critical theory. The critical theorists, almost all of them were hardcore Marxists, and at the end of the day, they believed in truth. They believed that this culture industry was kind of masking the truth, but there was a truth. The postmodernists, there's a debate of whether there's even a thing, truth can even exist. Whether truth as we understand it is just a notion. Truth is just a word. And that there are many truths. And this leads to a kind of moral relativism or a kind of artistic relativism, that there is no one worldview that you can present. So when we look at the Neo-Expressionists, we can see the influence of this, that they are trying to get beyond this, trying to deconstruct what it is we think we see. Probably the best example of how postmodernism affects the arts is going to be found in architecture. So this is the Philip Johnson House in New Canaan. We've taken a look at this before. The Philip Johnson House is the ultimate extension of where modernist ideals had led us. Philip Johnson was an architectural critic who himself became an architect and fully embraced the modernist vision. This is like a human aquarium. It's just a glass box. There's no decoration. There's no citation or no quotation of the past at all. It is just, absolutely stripped of anything that references anything like a column or a capital or a pediment, anything in historical architecture. So for somebody who fully embraced the modernist vision, you would expect that they would be kind of a true believer. But ironically, it is Philip Johnson that gives us some of the first true postmodernist architecture, and he does it in this, which is now the Sony building, but was the AT&T building at the time. Now, when this was designed, it was shocking. No one really knew what to do with it because this is so completely different. Now, I remember, this is the guy who designed this stripped down steel and glass box. And this is what he designs for the AT&T building in 1979. First of all, notice the pediment at the top. This is a skyscraper. It's a steel box. There is no reason for it to have this kind of elaborate broken pediment. It exists purely for the state of decoration. It takes its inspiration from broken pediments that go all the way back to the neoclassical period. So we reach all the way back to the neoclassical period. The other place it takes its inspiration is from highboys, these tall chests of drawers that existed in the 18th century, works done by people like Chippendale and other famous cabinet designers. So that's just bizarre. And not only that, but if you look down to the bottom, it actually has a kind of center aisle. It has a vault. This is almost like a Romanesque church with side aisles. And in fact, if you go inside, it has this monumental Art Deco statue that was commissioned for it. But if you look to the side, there are arches and columns and capitals. So we have neoclassical elements, we have furniture elements, we have Romanesque elements, we have Art Deco elements. We have all these different things from the past blended together and put together in this glorious mishmash. And it's a good example of what postmodern was. Postmodern said, okay, look, there is no truth. Modernism was all about truth. We're going to get things down to pure glass and steel because that's true, that's virtuous. And postmodernism comes along and says, truth, not so much. Who cares what truth is? What matters is language. But the thing is that once you freed yourself from this obligation to kind of a veracity or authenticity, the only thing is left is language. But because you're postmodernist, you're not tied into the vocabularies of the past, or you're not tied into them in any kind of strict way. So this thing uses inspiration from all the past. It doesn't want to give you just he could have just done a Romanesque style building. He could have just done something that was evocative of a single period. But no, we have Romanesque elements. We have neoclassical elements, Gibbsian. Gibbs was an architect in the 18th century who made copybooks that could be easily reproduced, and so he designed kind of pediments for doors and mantles for fireplaces and things like that. And so he just borrows it, cut and paste. So postmodernism has a kind of cut and paste sensibility. You are deconstructing the past. Any word that gets created, any vocabulary, visual vocabulary that gets in the past, you can recreate. You can recontextualize it, you can deconstruct it, and it now means something else. And this is something that postmodernism in the philosophy, post-structuralism, is very famous for, is that they will deconstruct words until words have completely lost their meaning or they mean something else. Postmodernism is also famous for neologisms. A neologism is a brand new word that you just pull out of a hat. I almost said some other part of your anatomy, or anyhow, but I didn't. Okay. See, I'm trying to keep this safe for my mom. My mom is out there watching. Ugh. I have to show things like benefit supervisor sleeping. I know that's not going to make her happy, but I gotta. So I try to keep it PG-13 at least, but sometimes I can't because it's contemporary art. It's crazy. So a neologism is just something you just pull out of the air or pull out of your ear, and it doesn't have any kind of history to it. You can create new terms. If you have a new idea, you create a new term. So postmodernism is going to be very cut and paste. It's going to take ideas from everywhere, and however you assemble them and however you interpret them, that's fine. All the old rules don't apply. In a way, Dadaism and pop art were very much responding to their times. They were taking the language of the culture around them and inverting it and putting it up there, pop art especially. But postmodernism is even a step beyond that. Postmodernism doesn't limit you to period, time, or even the original meaning of the word. Everything can and will be recontextualized. And that's where we get to some of my favorite postmodern artists and how they experimented with this. This is a team of artists, Vitaly Komar and Alexander Melamid, and they put together a team, and they were kind of playing on these ideas. So this is a painting that they call The Origins of Socialist Realism. So remember I mentioned socialist realism before. Socialist realism was this official art that always has happy, red youth, giving flowers to Stalin like he's their grandpa or something. And they look up at him in an admiring, godlike fashion. Oh, it's disgusting stuff. It's pure state propaganda. So they came from the former Soviet Union. They understood what this was like. And so they start playing on these ideas. And so what we have here is a otherwise completely Baroque scene. We have a figure that is a classical figure that represents a muse. And we have a single light source like in Baroque art. We have sweeping, draperies and classical columns. And then in the midst of this, we have rather incongruously Stalin, one of history's greatest mass murderers. Okay. And his shadow is cast upon the wall, and the muse, in purely academic fashion, cradles gently his chin under her hand to hold his head steady while she traces his profile. And of course, this is a reference to the origin of art in ancient Greece. That the myth in ancient Greece is that the word for drawing or painting in Greek is skiagraphia, shadow drawing. That the first artist was a shepherd who saw his shadow on a wall and traced it, and that was the first art. That art is supposed to mimic nature. It is supposed to be a shadow or a type of nature. And so they take all of those ideas and they invert it. And so you have something that seems inherently ridiculous and comical. Because, of course, Stalin was, insisting on works of art like this. Everything is a reflection of Stalin in socialist realism and of his great and glorious nation. Of course, it was all a lie. He was killing people by the millions and starving them out and engaged in the worst atrocities. But here we see the joke of it, is that in the Greek concept, everything was supposed to be a reflection of nature, but in socialist realism, everything is a reflection of Stalin. So it's very funny. You gotta love these guys. They really like to pull pranks on this. One of my favorite series they ever did is they sent out a survey. And the survey asked people what they liked to see in art. And they sent this survey all over the world. And so there were different results from people who were, say, in France as opposed to the United States or Germany or Japan or anywhere else. And so then they would compile those, survey results and then use them to generate paintings. So this is the most wanted painting for the United States. That what people in America liked was beautiful landscapes, representation of natures. We have a family, and then, of course, because it's America, George Washington. We get George Washington dropped into the middle of this landscape, which is ludicrous, but you can see, the whole process of doing this is ludicrous. This, by the way, is the least wanted painting. That abstraction was the least wanted. Here is the most and least wanted paintings for France. In this case, you still have families, you still have nature and a landscape, but George Washington has been replaced with haystacks because Monet is more important to French than their national leaders. This is the least wanted, which again is this work of abstraction. So there's definitely this tongue-in-cheek quality. There's this skewering, sarcastic, biting satire to postmodernism that forces us to look at our assumptions. Oh, I forgot, there's also like a church up there. A very, church, because you got to have a church for it's a French painting. Whereas, if you look to the American version, there's no church. Nature is our church. Nature and George Washington. I'm assuming if we did this today, there'd be a gigantic, 64-ounce soda in his hand and maybe an AR-15 in the other. But this was the 90s. This was a little bit more innocent time. So you have these kind of absurd methods of creating things. And again, it's meant to point out this is all kind of nonsense. I think the most extreme version of this is Sherry Levine. Sherry Levine was one of these postmodernists, and she started taking photographs and tried to replicate some things of the past, but that wasn't quite doing it for her. So what she did is she set up a camera in a gallery and took a picture of a very famous photograph by Walker Evans. Walker Evans being a very famous photographer who documented the 1930s Depression era for the government. Was given a commission to go out and document the plight of these Dust Bowl workers. And so he took a lot of these famous photographs. And so she took a photograph of a photograph, but she didn't take it like, pulled back so that you could see the frame and recognize this was a photograph of a photograph in a gallery. She took it so close that it was a near identical reproduction of the photograph. And then she put that photograph up in a gallery. And people were shocked. Like, you can't do that. You can't copy a Walker Evans and put it in a gallery and claim it's yours. And she was perfectly honest about her method in doing this, and she said, well, why not? And this actually gets into some bizarre features of American copyright law, and plays on this issue. If a painting is more than 150 or 200 years old, it's in the public domain. Even if it's 100 years old, it may be in the public domain, and any representation or image of it can go out on the internet. There's not anything you can do, but the photograph of that painting is made by a photographer. And so while the painter himself has died, or died before copyright even existed, copyright's only really been around for a couple hundred years, his copyright doesn't exist, but the photographer retains the copyright. He retains the ownership of the photo. And this was actually back in the 1990s. I used to work in a thing called Visual Resources, which doesn't exist anymore. These were slide libraries. Professors didn't have the internet, didn't have, images or Google image search. And so if they were putting together a lecture like this, they actually had to have slides, these glass slides, and put them in a slide projector. So we cataloged these slides. But we were getting into the era of digital images, and there were these huge fights over images. Who owns an image? Especially an image of a painting that was painted 500 years ago. And what was really awful is a lot of these museums were nervous about images of these paintings going out. So what they would do is they would forbid people from taking photographs in their museums, and then if you wanted a famous painting, they would get their photographer to take a picture of it, and since he was under contract with them, he retained the copyright, and they would sell you the painting. They would sell you a photograph of the painting. And so this was kind of a backdoor for them to assert ownership of things that you cannot own, an image, etc. This was really ridiculous. But the Getty was very famous for doing this. Thankfully, the digital age has changed that, and I think the Vatican was the first, the British Museum was the second, and the Met followed quickly after that. They said, hey, are we here to teach people about art or not? And they basically made their images available on the internet. You can just take them, use them. And, we want, anything that isn't owned by the copyright of the artist, anything that we own goes out. And so that's changed. Whew, thank goodness. Because we were worried about how, we were getting to the political, the I know there's the fair use rule, but the truth is, copyright strikes are a real thing. Who knows? I could get a copyright strike on this for showing images that I don't necessarily own, even though I'm giving a lecture on contemporary art. So who owns this image? Is it Walker Evans? Is it Sherry Levine? It's so crazy. And so by doing this, she forced us to recognize how ridiculous this is. What is the nature of an image? Does an image go out and belong to everybody? Or does it belong to the artist? What is it that makes an image? So while it's really cheeky, it's actually a very important concept. It's a very important thing to do. Well, probably the crown prince of postmodernism is going to be Jeff Koons. Jeff Koons in the 1980s burst onto the scene by doing a whole series of absurd things by putting vacuums in vitrine cases. Again, this isn't necessarily new. The idea of you take an object like a urinal and put it in the context of a museum, it suddenly becomes art. Likewise, he would take things like inflatable toys and he would have them made in stainless steel. So here is a very common inflatable rabbit, and he would render this out in stainless steel. Again, this isn't new. Jeff Koons stole this idea from Jasper Johns, if you remember, who was making beer cans in bronze. But Jeff Koons kind of industrialized this and took it out. Most of what Jeff Koons did was kind of a reiteration of what Andy Warhol and Jasper Johns and Marcel Duchamp had already done, or even Yves Klein, and in that regard. But he's come a superstar in many ways because he's the kind of fulfillment of what Andy Warhol was saying. That, Andy Warhol was famous for saying, I've mastered the business of art. I want to master the art of business. He called his studio the factory. He was all about the objectification and the brand making. And so Jeff Koons is very famous for his balloon animals and his flower puppy dogs, these massive installations, which he conceives of, but even then sometimes he doesn't conceive them. He has a whole team. He has a whole workshop of designers and creators who go out and make these things for them, and then they're kind of contracted out. So it's very much in the same way as Sherry Levine. Who is the creator? Which is the original? And it doesn't really matter. I do think that Roger Scruton was a very famous philosopher, and he was a philosopher of aesthetics and beauty. Very old-fashioned guy, just absolutely hated all modern art. But he did make a criticism of postmodern art that I thought was very accurate. That he called Andy Warhol was a genuine fake, while Jeff Koons was a kind of fake. I think is perfect. That Andy Warhol, what he was doing was fake, but he was doing it for important reasons. He was like, this is the world we live in. The world has become objectified. But we're now like a snake biting its own tail and, eating up its own tail so much that it's disappeared into nothing, that we are so folded into irony and deconstruction in the postmodern world that it doesn't even matter if it's fake. That whereas Andy Warhol was coming by these things genuinely, his stuff is fake. It's deliberately copied and lifted from the pop cultural world. There was a kind of there. But now you no longer need that kind of justification. The fakeness is the message. And I think that's certainly true of Jeff Koons. One of the ways that I think that postmodernism is most important is how it impacts gender and feminism. We have a whole slew of artists that come to the forefront in the postmodern period who are female artists or feminist artists. So gender becomes a very important issue. And one of my all-time favorites, and I think one of the smartest, is the photographer Cindy Sherman. Her work consists entirely of self-portraits, and she does a series of these. All of these are untitled, but we loosely call them after series because you can see that she's changing. And the first series that she did in the 1970s to the early 1980s was a series known as film stills. Now, here I'm going to have to go back in history. In Hollywood, there are these things called film stills. In the golden age of Hollywood, you would often have a photographer on set, and for purposes of publicity, he would take pictures of people on set, and he would have them in character. So you're not taking a picture to promote the actors, taking a picture to promote the film. And so the actors are in costume, they're in character. And so you'll oftentimes get film stills of scenes that never happened in the movie. This scene that you see here from the Maltese Falcon never happened in the movie. It's just something that a photographer said, oh, this will look good, let's put you together. So this is something that goes out on title cards or posters to promote the film. This was a very common form of publicity in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They're there to create kind of tension or drama, but they're also completely fake. They're staged. They're even a level of fake beyond the film because they're not scenes that appear in the film. They're just scenes shot on the set in costume and character. So she was captivated by these, so she started producing her own, and she casts herself in this role. And she will dress up in costumes. So she created a series of film stills for movies that never existed. This is Untitled Film Still 21. This is another one that's from that same series. And I love how she's dressed like she came from an Alfred Hitchcock movie. If you look at Alfred Hitchcock movies, they all have these Dutch angles. A Dutch angle is these high-raking angles that create anxiety. She puts herself in a blonde wig because Alfred Hitchcock liked blondes. And the blondes are either these femme fatales or these, ingenues who are going to, stumble into some kind of horror or terror. And you can see how this is very objectifying and very sexist in a way. So here we have a female artist that's kind of reinterpreting that. She did a whole bunch of these for all kinds of movies that weren't just, Alfred Hitchcock movies, but movies of the 60s and 70s, creating all of these kind of false identities. But what's funny is that these images are so stereotypical, we instantly recognize them. So here's a case where we have a female artist appropriating and reappropriating stereotypical imagery to create a different image. Then she went and did a whole series that were kind of body or sex themed, and this one's really fascinating because this is the aftermaths of a bulimic binge session where we see vomit and broken food. I love the look of horror you can see reflected, and these are self-portraits of her in her own glasses. In the 80s, anorexia, bulimia, eating disorders were very famous. There was a number of very famous celebrities who had it. Tracy Gold, who I don't know anybody remembers anymore, but she was on a family sitcom. Karen Carpenter, the singer, suffered from it and died from it. So this was a way of exploring, again, body and identity through, dealing with these kind of images. And then, of course, by the time she got to the late 90s, she started doing history. She started doing art history, dressing herself up as figures from the famous pictures of art history. So here we have a virgin, a lactating virgin, which is the correct term. The lactating virgin. It's a trope in medieval art. Go look at it. If you want to blow your mind, okay, here, go blow your mind. Go Google the lactation of Saint Bernard. It's a trippy medieval image. Weird iconography. I'll say no more. Have a fun time. But she also did, if you remember our discussions on Caravaggio. So this is her dressing herself up and the guise of Caravaggio. She's still around and she's still doing fun stuff. What I love is that now she's tackled the era of social media. That she's tackled things like glamour portraits or selfies, and she deconstructs how those make women appear. So she's still in this, still doing really wonderful stuff. I just love her stuff. Doing wonderful stuff, deconstructing the image of how we represent women and always using herself, putting herself in that role. Really fun stuff. Another artist who's doing similar things at the same time was Jenny Holzer. Jenny Holzer really was one of the first to move into these commercial spaces. This is Times Square. I know it's a lot, the Jumbotron is a lot bigger there today than it was then, but when this was created, that was a huge billboard. That was a huge billboard that had moving text on it. And so what she did is she got the opportunity and convinced these people to let her, take this. And on this symbol of vibrant capitalism at the center of Times Square, which is even more a symbol of corporate capitalism today than it was then. It was still a little bit authentic now. Now it's been completely Disneyfied. But back then she persuaded them to put up these slogans. And this was her Times Square series. And they say things like, private property created crime, protect me from what I want. She still does these beautiful installations, except now she's moved on to large-scale projections, where, again, because postmodernism focuses on language and the power of words to shape reality, she's using these words, projecting them at enormous scale onto buildings. One of the funner groups was the Guerrilla Girls. The Guerrilla Girls was an anonymous group of activists, artists, and designers, and it actually had a kind of shifting membership. There's been several famous artists that were part of this. They were always anonymous. Some of them have been outed, but most of them preferred not to be outed. And they actually decided to, again, much like Jenny Holzer, appropriate the means of public media to give messages. And they were very famous for going around and slapping up posters of all kinds, and when they did it, they would put on these gorilla masks. Again, there's a play on words. Gorilla can mean somebody who's like a fighter in a jungle in a conflict, or it can be an actual gorilla. So there's a pun there. So the Guerrilla Girls are culture warriors fighting against what they see as the patriarchy and what they see as oppression. And so they would put up really funny things like this. Dear art collector, has come to our attention that your collection, like most, does not contain enough art by women, etc. I love this one. They would get enormous billboards or posters or bus shelters, and they would put up signs. So this is, appropriating the means of mass media to advance an activist cause, but in the service of art. Couldn't get more postmodern than that. I love these. The advantages of being a woman artist, working without the pressure of success. There's a few of these. It's like not being stuck at a tenured teaching position. Seeing your ideas live on in the work of others. There's some great stuff here. So a lot of this is, again, very edgy, very text-based, very conceptual-based, but using the imagery of capitalism to attack consumerism. One of the most famous, though, is going to be Barbara Kruger. Barbara Kruger actually got her start in kind of magazine design and layout, and she took that design experience and used the Futura font that was blowing up everywhere to create these short slogans, oftentimes juxtaposed with clip art that gives it a kind of edgy meaning. This one is perhaps the most famous. I shop, therefore I am. Here's another Barbara Kruger. We don't need another hero. Again, this wonderful clip art that probably comes from the 1950s that shows a boy trying to impress a girl with his muscles. Again, the text is directly opposite. It deconstructs the image. That's what postmodernism is all about. Likewise, she does these large-scale installations using lots of text. So very similar to Jenny Holzer, but has her own kind of spin. And she's still active today, doing wonderful stuff. But it's reached a place I don't really know what to think about anymore. Because in 2007, she did a massive installation for Selfridges. Selfridges is a department store chain. And as part of their, big Christmas push, Black Friday Christmas season push, she did a massive installation for them that is cynical about the nature of capitalism and the promises of consumerism that we've inherited since World War II. And here you can see it. It's you, it's new, it's everything, it's nothing. It uses her slogan, I shop, therefore I am. You want it, you buy it, you forget it. Things like this. Buy me, I'll change your life. You want it, you buy it, you forget it. And these are everywhere. And this was part of their ad campaign. Now, that's just bizarre. Now, I think she was actually, delighted when her slogan, "I shop, therefore I am," which was a play on the "I think, therefore I am," actually turned into a kind of mantra of the 1980s, this kind of crass materialism that had just embraced it. Materialism and consumerism as a justification of being. And boy, my gosh, we have really gone around the bend. We have, so artwork that is meant to point out cynically the emptiness and hollowness of mass consumerism is now being used to sell mass consumerism. I can't get over it. It just blows my brain. There is nothing in the world you can create that cannot be marketed by capitalism. If there's one thing that says the superiority of capitalism, it's the ability of capitalism to sell anything up to and including anti-capitalism. I mean, it's just amazing. And I'm sure she loves it. I'm sure she loves the inherent irony of this. It's like those Che Guevara shirts, they're being mass-produced in sweatshops in China to be sold to hipsters so that they can project how much they love communism, and a capitalist is getting rich off of it somewhere. So this is the world we live in. I mean, and I think postmodernism deals with this very well. And I'm not going to be a hypocrite about this, people. I've said this before, that, the consumerist world is the world we live in, and, people like to posture. They like to virtue signal and say, well, I'm not part of that. We're going to have a better, no. We all love it. We love it. Just admit it. We love being up to our eyeballs and our gadgets, our doodads, the latest editions, the latest versions. A new phone comes out, we gotta have it. New technology comes out, we gotta have it. And all this produces jobs and wealth and also global warming and environmental impact. But let's not talk about that. Because that's the thing, the truth is that we really need to come to terms with this, is that we really do love it. We do. And I think that, pop art and a lot of postmodern just kind of acknowledges it. That, we kind of embrace the decadence and the hypocrisy of it. And, hey, there's no way to get around it. Another example, one of my all-time, recent favorites is Kara Walker. So Kara Walker is an African-American artist that I first was introduced to in the 90s when one of her exhibits came through the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. Again, another artist that we could type as one of these postmodernists who's deconstructing. Again, using quotations. So Holzer and Barbara Kruger were pulling things from media and mass production and consumerism and contextualizing it that way. Kara Walker actually goes back to a very ancient art form. Well, not too ancient. I mean, it's a few hundred years. That's not so ancient. It's not thousands of years. But before the advent of photographs, the way that you would get an image of, say, your loved one was through a silhouette. Someone would trace a silhouette. And so silhouettes and paper cuttings were very popular in the 18th century and the early 19th century as an art form for showing little tableaus, little vignettes or scenes, but mostly for portraits. And so this is a very old art form. Well, there's something interesting about that art form. That art form is from the antebellum period. That is from the period of slavery in America. She, being African American, thought that was very interesting. So this silhouette cutting, this paper cutting, which was associated with this very genteel age, also came from an age that covered up an awful lot of ugliness, the abuse of slavery. So she started creating these large-scale paper silhouette installations. They often have trees with hanging Spanish moss to indicate this is the South. And rather than give a correct representation of, say, African Americans or Southerners of the time, she gives this kind of grotesque version of it. She fully embraces these rather racist stereotype and caricatured features of figures, showing them in perverse and sexual ways. And so you can see you have, I'll just go through, we have a variety of figures here, including kind of mammy figures and little, black figures that are grotesque, racist stereotypes, and also, kind of white idealized stereotypes. to show the very complicated moral nature of that. Now, again, I don't think these are meant to be read in a specific narrative. Rather, they're meant to give you a suggestion of the cruelty and the conflict of the era and how it was represented. And the titles are an equal part of that. This one, Gone, a historical romance of a civil war as it occurred between the dusky thighs of one young negress and her heart. These are kind of plays on the kind of dime store novels and pamphlets that existed at the time that often had these long, ridiculous titles. So it's a play again on the era, but it also gives this kind of enrichment. This one is another fabulous one, Slavery, presenting a grand and lifelike panoramic journey into picturesque Southern slavery, or Life at Old Virginia's Hole, sketches from plantation life. See the peculiar institution as never before, all cut from black paper by the able hand of Cara Elizabeth Walker, an emancipated negress and leader in her cause. Okay, and yes, that's the whole title. That's the actual formal title of the piece. And on the test, you must get it absolutely correct, or I will... No, I'm joking. So, she actually plays on this idea that there were emancipated slaves in the pre-war Civil War period who went north, and even for the abolitionists, they were sometimes objectified and turned into these heroes or, kind of things. It's kind of an incredibly complicated era. So not only are these things kind of beautifully done, these beautiful tableaus, but they deal with these complicated issues of race, of how race was represented in the past, and forcing people to look at it. One of her more recent pieces happened in 2014, which I just absolutely love. This is A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby. So many people are unaware of how important sugar was to the United States and to the New World economy. Most of the slaves that were brought over in the transatlantic slave trade were not sent to America. They were sent across the Caribbean and Latin America, and they were not there to grow tobacco and cotton. They were there to grow sugar. And Americans have more sugar in their diet than anybody else, and that's not accidental because of these huge conglomerates. So she took over this warehouse that actually was a warehouse for an actual sugar company. So the location is critical. And out of styrofoam covered in sugar and other statues covered in molasses, this byproduct of the sugar industry, she creates this incredible tableau of these children who are seen as workers. And then in the center we have this figure that's like a sphinx. So it represents, the kind of power. It gives this kind of ancient grandeur to the sugar industry, but of course it has this figure of this stereotypical mammy, African figure that has been kind of sexualized. And so it shows that the commodification of things like sugar, even something as simple as sugar, does have this complicated racial past that we often neglect. And those sugar companies are still around, by the way. A lot of the companies that existed from before the Civil War and elsewhere, a lot of them are still around. And so when you start getting into issues of reparations and questions of reparations and fairness and equity, these are all questions that, we just ignore. We eat our sugar, we like our sugar, and we don't think about the history of how it came to America. So beautiful piece, but also very powerful, very site-located. And that brings us to, really the last, 30, 25 years. And we have a number of movements that happen, and there's really no coherent singular movement left. And I'm just going to race through these because, again, a better place to talk about these would be in my contemporary art class. But one of the big movements that comes is the Young British Artist movement. This is a movement that happened in the 1990s, and most of these were people who came out of the BFA program at Goldsmiths, the University of London. Many of them were Turner Prize winners. The Turner Prize is the Tate Gallery's highest award to a living modern artist. And they caused an absolute sensation. There was an exhibition in 1997 at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. It moved eventually to the Brooklyn Museum. And this was one of the most infamous paintings. And this was Chris O'Feely. Chris O'Feely created this painting of the Virgin Mary, and he used animal dung, elephant dung, as a kind of elephant dung in African cultures is used as fertilizer, so it has this kind of quality of being, fecund, and that was what he meant by it. And then he covered it with pieces of art that in a collage fashion that were taken from pornographic magazines. Well, here's where art gets really cynical, and I'm afraid, the cynical history of this is this painting was designed to shock. Chris O'Feely, for his case, really, he makes the argument that he was doing this sincerely, that the symbolism of this was what he was after. But whatever the case of O'Feely's justification, clearly the curator at the Brooklyn Museum knew that this was going to cause a problem. And the person who was the mayor of New York at the time, who I'm still amazed is still in the news, was Rudy Giuliani. And Rudy Giuliani is an interesting character because he was a moderate Republican and a very good mayor of New York. It prospered under his rule, but he had presidential aspirations at the time. There was a presidential election coming up in a year, and he needed something that would break him out onto the national scene. And so what did he try to do? He tried to make a play for the social conservatives. Now, Rudy Giuliani was never convincing as a social conservative. I mean, he's dressed in drag on television for a gag. When he got booted out of his house I think he got booted out of his house because he was cheating on his wife, and he stayed with his gay friends. So he was not exactly somebody who had hardcore conservative credentials. But he was a Catholic, and so he decided, I'm going to make a play. And so he condemned this painting in the hopes, I think, that this would elevate his standing amongst social conservatives. And I'm sorry, I think it was completely cynical. I try not to be political, but this one deals with art history, so I can be a little political. I think it was a completely cynical move on his part. But to be fair, I think the curator at the Brooklyn Museum knew he was going to do it. And he was like, oh, this is shocking art censorship that he would condemn this. And so they were both really, really cynical. And of course, what happened? Ticket sales went through the roof, and everybody had to go see this painting to say, what is the scandal about? So there is something that has happened in the modern age since the 90s where there's kind of been a disconnect from the public and the art world. And it's happened because people just see the art world as this kind of this cynical exploitation for the sake of it. And I think probably the best example of that is going to be Damien Hirst. Damien Hirst is this artist who became famous for these tank pieces. He would create these large taxidermied, objects. Well, not taxidermied, just pickled in formaldehyde. And he gave him these titles, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. This one went on to go sell for $12 million, which was an enormous sum at the time. Now, for his part, to give the best case to this work of art, he realized that he was trying to say that, death was something that we didn't confront, and a shark is, we have Shark Week on, cable news every year, and so, on cable TV, and so he decided it was this emblem of death in people's public consciousness. He wanted to confront them with it. He'd done a number of things like this in the past, but for many people this just seemed to be a ridiculous pretense, and it seemed that the more ridiculous art became, the more that it got gobbled up by the art world, and the more the public turned away from it, the more alienated that they became. And there was a number of books that were written about this time. There's a book, I can't remember the author now, called The Curious Case of the $12 Million Shark, that looked into the economics of this. There was also a series of books written by Sarah Thornton, which I think she wrote a book called 12 Days in the Art World. She's a journalist in art. And all of these books commented that somehow the art world had become completely detached from society in a bizarre way. It didn't even respond to the interests of art critics or art historians anymore, that you had a few blue chip galleries. And there was even, these blue chip galleries would only sell to the highest patrons, like billionaires. Daniel Radcliffe, actor from the Harry Potter series, he actually tried to buy a painting at one of these, and they refused because he wasn't famous enough. Can you believe it? And so they realized that something sinister was happening, that most of these young British artists that were being pushed in this sensation exhibition were collected by Saatchi. Saatchi was a very famous collector, and there was something really incestuous about this, that billionaires would buy works of art for millions of dollars. This would elevate the status of these artists. These artists would only be served by certain galleries. These galleries would then, elevate and pick and choose which artists were chosen. And it stopped feeling like it was something natural and organic that was happening in the culture, and it started to feel like a racket. And I have a few contacts, and I can tell you that those contexts tell you, yeah, it feels really strange. The art world is a lot different since the 90s. Billionaires got involved, and art ceased to be something that was organic, reacting to the society, and it started to be this kind of club or niche club for billionaires to prove that they had that much money. It became, really, that's what it was. I had a friend, he's an agent. He's not an agent anymore, but at the time he was an agent, and he was an agent. What I mean by that is he's somebody who advises billionaires on what to buy in art. Can you believe that job even exists? It's an amazing job. Oh, the places he's gone, the private jets he's flown on. Anyhow, and he said that when he first went to Art Basel, Miami. Art Basel is the largest contemporary art market in the world. It happens in Switzerland, in Basel, and then there's also another one in Miami because it's Miami. Who wouldn't rather be in Miami? Anyhow, and he said that one time when he went there, that all of the major artists, that all of the works were sold before they even unloaded them off the trucks. Now, if you're buying for millions of dollars artists' work that you haven't even seen, you're not buying the art. You're buying the artist's name. You're buying the brand. Now, is that enough? I mean, maybe we've reached the level where things are so deconstructed that we can, it doesn't matter anymore. That maybe that's what you are buying. Maybe you're buying the concept of the artist. But to a lot of people, that feels very cynical. And I actually kind of like Damien Hirst's earlier works, the things like the tank pieces. But now he's doing a lot of derivative stuff that seems excessive for the sake of being excessive. Like a human skull covered in diamonds is, really kind of, it's deliberately kitschy. It cost him $1 million just in diamonds alone. And again, this was not something he made. He had craftsmen make this. So he's kind of detached from the production process. It's really kind of fascinating how, at least in the galleries, art has become something else. So I want to talk briefly, in just 10 minutes, about some other things that are happening, because I really do think that we're reaching a tipping point in our galleries, that gallery artists seem to be a whole separate phenomenon that seem completely detached from whatever else is going on. But there's some trends that have happened in the last 40, 50 years that are really worth exploring, that are different. And some of those have to do with new media. One of the things that emerges is of course new media, and the grandfather of digital or video art is Namjoon Pak, a Korean artist who in the 70s started doing things like this. He started doing closed-circuit TV between a statue of a Buddhist monk and a TV. Of course, if you are a Buddhist monk, the whole point is to reflect on your self, or, as it is more often the case, your lack of self, the illusion of self. And yet a camera with a closed-circuit TV kind of reinforces the self. So this is fascinating kind of dialogue emerging. He's one of the first to actually do massive banks of videos of television sets. Here we have the electronic superhighway. He's the person who coined that term, by the way, in the 1990s, in the earliest days of the internet. And each state is represented by a TV that flashes a series of images that represent that state, and they're surrounded by neon. So I can't quite figure out what Utah's is, but it's very clear to show that Idaho's is potatoes. They're good potatoes. There were other artists that were doing similar things with video. One of my favorites is Bruce Nauman. Bruce Nauman would create these video installations where these were his corridor series. He would put a closed-circuit TV into a corridor, and then you would walk into this corridor. But the corridor was so narrow that you almost couldn't turn around in it. You kind of had to shimmy your way sideways. And if you looked up to the closed-circuit TV, you could see the camera, but you couldn't see the TV because the TV was on one end and the camera was on another. I didn't explain that very well. So imagine you're going down this corridor, and down at the end of the corridor is a television set, and it shows you the back of your head because the camera is behind you. Well, you do what all people do. You instinctively move around to take a look at the camera, but now you can't see yourself. You can see the camera, but you can't see yourself. But the TV is showing an image of you looking at the back of your head. It's very anxiety producing. And this interaction of the TV and the video causes anxiety in a way that you couldn't do almost any other way. Perhaps his most famous installation, or infamous installation, is clown torture, where you walk around a gallery of these videos of clowns being tortured or in a state of distress. I hate clowns, so I can't even leave this on the screen, but I mean, I've seen it. It's not something you want to experience. But the introduction of digital or video actually gives new dimension to something. One of my favorites of these that came out of the 90s is Mona Hatum's Corps étranger, which means strange bodies. And you walk into this room, and the room is projecting a video image on the floor, and the video image is a series of images of endoscopic explorations of her own body. It's the gentlest way I can put that. So she took an endoscope and shoved him up her nose and various other bodily orifices. You can see her teeth there in one of them. And this is interesting because it was a way of saying, you know, we don't know the interiors of our bodies. You know, we know them through x-rays and MRIs, but they're really mysterious to us and have been for most of the time. And so this is a bizarre way of looking at a human body. It's a very intimate way of looking at a body, but also it's very kind of detached because we don't recognize the interior organs of ourselves. So it's really kind of an interesting metaphor for exploring self. I really quite like it. And it's not a pleasant, but again, art's not necessarily about pleasant. But I also like that a lot of this interactive technology is producing some really interesting stuff. Random International is a group of artists and designers who do experiences, and they did this room which has been traveling around the country. I think it's now permanently installed at the LA County Museum of Art. Maybe I'm wrong, but it was there for a while. And what they did is they invented a room with a bunch of little different spigots all over the surface of the ceiling, and there are ultrasound sensors. So as you walk into the room, there's this downpour of rain, but as you walk under the sensors, it turns the spigots off, so that the rain is all around you, but it's not falling directly on you. So you can walk across the room from one side to the other in a downpour, but never actually get wet. Maybe a drop or two, and that's it. People have actually run back and forth across this room trying to get wet, and they can't get wet. The technology is so good. So the technology has allowed for creating these interactive experiences on a level that we've never seen before. One of my favorite kind of examples of this is 3D technology. So Karen Sander, a German artist, would scan people using scanning technology and then would print a 3D body scan of a living person. And then these would be printed out as kind of small figurines and placed into the exhibit. Now what's interesting is that you as a person could contribute to this by having your body scanned, and so you could actually go and see a scan of yourself. You know, you could show up one day, get scanned, and show up the next day, and you would be there. This rapid new technology has allowed us to create some interesting things. In fact, this is Karen Sander herself holding one of her own figurines, been scanned. So again, the concepts of identity and technology are really kind of pushing boundaries here. One of the things that's really exploded that I think is wonderful is graffiti or street art. That we have a kind of native movement of art that has emerged. It's native to the United States. It was born in Philadelphia. I used to live in Philly, so Philly pride. And the person who's generally credited as being the world's first graffiti writer is Daryl McRae, who went by the name Cornbread, and he would go around tagging his name on things, Cornbread. And people assumed there was this young man named by the name of Cornelius who got killed, and so people assumed that when he died, well, he must be the tagger. And Daryl McRae said, well, I'm not going to let somebody else steal my fame. So he actually went and tagged an entire zoo, the Philly Zoo, and he even tagged the elephant. Now, of course, that's not ethical. He wouldn't do that today. But that shows the kind of nature of it. And it had, of course, tagging and graffiti writing had this very stylized form. And so graffiti emerged as a kind of vibrant street movement. Of course, it was associated with the gang culture and the street culture that was along with it. And it became very, very controversial in the 1990s. And in fact, in the 1990s, we had this huge battle over graffiti. Subways were just covered in its cities, and many of the city leaders were considering it to be a blight. And you have people like Jan Golden, who founded the Anti-Graffiti Network or the Mural Arts Program in Philadelphia as a way to counter this. And she tried to create, murals that were kind of uplifting and positive. But of course, the thing about it, and mural is she tried very much to integrate the local community in the production of these, but also sometimes he's been criticized for being very saccharine, being very maudlin, and not being authentic. Meanwhile, cities adopted a kind of buffing policy. That is, any graffiti that went up was buffed immediately within 24 hours because you didn't want to encourage this kind of thing. And most places did that. And so the graffiti wars, I'm sad to say that for obvious reasons, businesses, private places didn't want the graffiti to go up because it attracted crime, and there is some statistics on this. A lot of the graffiti that went up were memorials to people who were the victims of gang violence or drive-by shootings. What happens then is one memorial goes up, another gang comes up, they deface the memorial, and then the site becomes a locus for more violence. And so the policy became just to buff all graffiti, just to get rid of it, paint it over as soon as possible. But graffiti artists decided that, we can't let this happen, and so they looked for other venues. They went to abandoned buildings, or they started doing graffiti on temporary surfaces like saran wrap around trees. For example, you can see, if you put graffiti on saran wrap, and I've actually spoken to a few graffiti artists and they say it's amazing. If I paint something on a wall in 24 hours, it's painted over. But if I put it between two light poles on saran wrap, it stays up for weeks because people like it. It's the threat against personal property. And again, we're getting into issues again of who owns the public spaces. So one of the places that they did this was what became the mecca for graffiti writers, which was a place in New York City called 5 Points. And graffiti writers from all over the world would come to do graffiti of all kinds. Eventually, and the owner of the building kind of had an understanding. He would let them do this. The building wasn't worth anything, and he was just holding on it. Eventually, property prices went up in New York, and so he buffed it. He had it all removed, and he had it all kind of scrubbed clean. And this became the source of an actual court case. And amazing, the graffiti writer said that by allowing us to paint here, he had granted us an easement on the property. And the rule amongst the graffiti writers was, nothing was permanent, but, if you did a piece of graffiti and somebody put another piece of graffiti over the top of it, that was okay. But the owner, by painting it over, violated their artistic rights. And amazingly, the court upheld that argument and awarded damages to the graffiti writers. I don't know how you would ever make that award. That's still working its way through the courts, but it's this incredible argument about who owns the public spaces. If you go and attack the public space, is it the private person, is the person who owns the wall who owns that artwork? And if he doesn't want it there, is it not there? The old generation of graffiti writers knew that nothing was permanent, but of course you want to get your name out. You want your fame. I love this one. This is a street artist who did stencil work, and when he saw the guy buffing the location, he went back and took a photo of him and then made him a piece of urban art. So we see a transition emerge in the 1990s, and the transition moves away from graffiti writing to street art. That is, this is art. Graffiti writing was mostly about typography, fabulous writing, what they call wild style, and it was also associated with the name of the artist himself. But street art was designed to find that sweet spot of middle-class sensibilities where it appealed to their middle-class sensibilities but still got through the message. And I find it so fascinating that we're seeing a shift away from galleries. As the galleries became more and more in the pocket of the billionaires, and more this kind of incestuous relationship between a set of blue-chip galleries and billionaires and a handful of artists that were chosen by those galleries, artists started going to other places. They started going online. And it also isn't an accident this happened right at the same time that the internet happens. because the internet becomes the memory for street art, because the street art's going to be buffed off the walls. So you start to see the development of street art. And the history of this is really kind of interesting. You know, some of the first to do this are going to be people like Basquiat. Basquiat started out as Samo. Samo was his tagger name. And instead of doing, you know, tagging that was kind of elevating his name, he was doing this stuff in New York City, in Manhattan, that was very wry and very funny. For example, like, which of the following is omnipresent? Lee Harvey Oswald, Coca-Cola logo, or Samo. That, you know, this kind of irony. And he put the copyright symbol after his name, so which had to appeal to people's certain sense of irony. He eventually made the jump to gallery art and started doing his kind of own neo-expressionist work based on his street art. The same thing is true of Keith Haring. Keith Haring was just this kid who noticed that there were these black posters over the top of subway ads. When a subway ad would hit its run, they would just paint it over or plaster it over with black, and these made perfect chalkboards for his cute little quirky drawings. He too, you know, became recognized for these were drawings of something he could do very quick, and he used this to elevate into his own art career. And so we're starting to see street artists as a viable way of coming to the attention of the public and of elevating yourself above everybody else. But our first street artists started moving into the gallery, but it quickly became apparent by the 1990s that the street was where you wanted to be, that the street was what could achieve ubiquity for you. And probably the most famous example is Shepard Fairey. Shepard Fairey is the guy who designed the famous Obama poster, the Yes We Can poster. And he was putting up stickers and putting up posters. And one day he had a friend, he wanted to get into it, and he said, look, it's not that complicated. And he literally just took what was available on a newspaper, traced it, turned it into it, added a slogan, Andre the Giant has a posse, and he put it up. And he put a bunch of these up, and, you know, who knows why, but this thing really resonated with people. He had created one of the first memes, one of the first things. And he noticed that people started making copies of his sticker and putting them up. So he used his design experience, and he made a much more simplified sticker that was easier to replicate. And so these Obey stickers were everywhere in the 1990s. And Shepard Fairey was maybe responsible for a tenth of them. Most of them were being put up by copycats, that an idea gets generated and it starts to spread. And suddenly an artist, you know, had a different avenue. You could become an artist not by selling works of art or by getting a grant or something like that, but by achieving a certain level of notoriety because you began to influence the culture. The big name that broke through all this with Banksy. Banksy was a graffiti writer who was doing these kind of things, and he moved to stencils because he said it was a quicker way to put things up, and he didn't want to get arrested. Truth is, stencils were being done by Lebec the Rat, who was a French street artist. And a lot of ideas he stole from Lebec the Rat, but never mind. And he started creating these, and he really broke through when he started putting them in controversial locations. This one is a very famous one he did on the Separation Wall. This is the wall that was built by the Israeli government between the Palestinian occupied territories and the in the West Bank and the rest of Israel to stop the influx of terrorism in the wake of the Second Intifada. And so what he did is, and of course these walls became places of checkpoints. This is a lot of Palestinians still work in Israel, that's where the jobs are, and so they have to cross the wall. It became a huge hindrance to them. And as they crossed, they had to be searched, frisked, etc., to make sure they weren't transporting bombs, weapons, etc. It really was a terribly violent time. If you want to get into the politics of the wall, it's complicated. I strongly suggest you talk to people on both sides because it is such a complicated issue. But there's no doubt that it created this very difficult circumstance for the lives of Palestinians. And so he inverts this. He takes an Israeli soldier, and instead of the Israeli soldier frisking down people, he has a little girl frisking down a soldier. So, inverting it. And because it was this location, it drew attention to the plight of the Palestinian people in this way. Utah has its own Banksies. There's a couple of Banksies up in Park City. Park City is the site of the Sundance Festival. And he made a movie, Exit Through Gift Shop. And to kind of promote the movie, he made his own. And created this work, which is right off the main street in Park City. Now again, this is a piece of vandalism. This is technically a piece of graffiti, but it shows by that time Banksy had become so famous that in order to prevent vandalism from being vandalized, the owner of the building has now placed it under bulletproof glass. You just can't make this stuff up. So we are moved into a world that is just bizarre. You know, I remember seeing this documentary about the crews that clean up graffiti in Bristol, England, and they were actually given discretion to say, well, this is graffiti and this is art. And it's like, how can you make that choice? How can you make a choice if... So we now live in a world where if you paint something on a public building or a private building, it might be regarded as art and have to be preserved. And so, I mean, in a way, what the original graffiti writers were saying, hey, nobody asked us if we wanted to see these billboards advertising McDonald's or Coca-Cola. We didn't get a say-so in this space. And it really has opened up the question of who owns the public space? And the answer is nobody knows anymore. Of course, if you overturn all the property rights, then your cities end up being, just kind of graffiti-strewn, post-apocalyptic landscapes, and nobody wants that. But at the same time, we want stuff that's wonderful and neat and interesting. It's kind of a wonder that it pops up. Now, Banksy, I think Banksy is really commercial. He's kind of a sellout, I'll be honest. But Banksy has managed to hit that absolute sweet spot between being edgy enough that it's really hip, but also matching the sensibilities of middlebrow and middle-class taste, so his stuff doesn't get out. I actually think a better artist is JR. I think JR is a much better artist. JR is what he calls a photographer. What he does is he takes photographs, prints them up on massive scale. He himself is of mixed descent, and he is French, and he was there at the time of these riots in the banlieue. The banlieues are these suburbs that surround Paris, and they're the home to large immigrant populations from North Africa, Algeria, etc. And many of these people are French citizens, but they're treated like second-class citizens, and there were huge riots that broke out. And he noticed that in the media, they were only ever portraying people of immigrant descent in a negative light. And so he decided to take pictures of people in his neighborhood and just blast them up over Paris to show them as real people. And this really captivated the French, and it was a success. And so, unlike Banksy, who's more or less about promoting Banksy, JR was actually promoting this kind of socially conscious ideal. And he, too, went to the separation wall, and he took photos of Jews, Arabs, Christians, all kind of groups, and again, to humanize them and to show them in this human way. And he works with workshops to do this all over the world. One of his more recent pieces, which went up in 2017, he took a photo of a girl who was in Mexico who was on a crib, and he said, that's perfect. And he found a building on the other side of the Mexican border opposite the wall, and placed her on that building so that it looks like she's looking over the wall. Of course, this deals with the wall and the immigration issue in the United States, bringing awareness to the very difficult situation there on the border. Another similar example of this is Candy Chang. Candy Chang was an artist who was captivated by all these abandoned buildings in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. So she took a building, and instead of this just being something that was lost, she wanted to turn it into something that could build community. And this is where I think the street and the urban art and where art is really going, is that instead of an artist being somebody who makes something and puts it on a wall and says, look at me, I'm such a genius, an artist becomes a facilitator. He becomes a collaborator with a community, building community and building identity. You can see this in the works of JR especially. Banksy's out for Banksy, sorry. But JR is really trying to build things, and so is Candy Chang. So she painted this wall with this Before I Die, and left these blanks so that people could take chalk and write and make their own story. So I think if there's something to say about where art is going, is that it amazes me, but the gallery culture that emerged in the 19th century, that emerged in the wake of the Salon des Refusés and the beginning of the independent salons, which pretty much dominated the art world, I think that's come to an end. I think it really has. I think that the gallery culture is its own little again, I was going to use a crude term, but my mother may be listening, is a self-fulfilling circle. Gosh, that's so terrible. That's so awful. Okay, I don't want to get fired. I don't want my mom to hate me. The gallery culture has become this very, very incestuous, let us say, arrangement between billionaires and some top-tier artists and some top-tier galleries that are doing their own thing. And I think the really interesting stuff is actually happening out in the streets. It's happening online. It's happening out with artists who are experimenting in social media and elsewhere. And so while the gallery culture was a democratization of art, certainly, it opened it up to the free market, we're now seeing it go even further than that. And I think we're seeing a true democratization of art. And the artist is more about being a facilitator of lots of people's visions instead of just being the executor of his own. He still has his own creative vision that he brings to that, but that's the direction I see it going. So, interesting, fun stuff. We'll end it there. That's the class, people. Again, if you want to talk more about contemporary art, particularly what's happened in the last 50 years, take my contemporary art class. That's 3120. When I do that class, it'll be online, and I will put those lectures online. So if you're following this on YouTube, they will be available. We'll go a little bit more in depth. I appreciate all of you people who have been listening. Certainly all my students, thank you for hanging in there this whole time. I know it's been rough moving this all online. And those of you that have picked up on YouTube, I appreciate you as well. Thanks so much. All the comments, anytime I'm down, I just listen to the comments and it makes my day. So I really appreciate it. And we will catch you next time. Bye-bye.